Morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be back here with the DMA. I always say I measure the years going by in my time as Information Commissioner by appearances at the DMA, because there's something quite reassuring to be back with a marketing audience, because I did spend quite some time, as Fidelma has explained to you, as the Director General of the Advertising Standards Authority and as the Chair of the European Advertising Standards Alliance. And although we have differences, and I nevertheless think I understand a bit of the language and a bit of the needs and the pressures, let me put you at ease about what those websites are all about. I mean, you would expect that a former managing editor of news programs would follow the news on the BBC. That's not my only source of news, I hasten to say. The ICO website, if you haven't encountered it, can I commend it to you? ico.org.uk, because it's full of useful guidance, which, of course, you will need to follow. And I'm very reassured to hear that so many of you have clocked that one. And I hope you've also subscribed to our newsletter and are following us on Twitter and all the rest of it. But what about the other two? Well, Journey Latin America reflects the other side of my responsibilities as Information Commissioner, because, you know, the Information Commissioner is responsible for the right to privacy, but also the right to know, as well as the Data Protection Act and the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations. I'm responsible for the Freedom of Information Act and the Environment Information Regulations. And this year's international conference of FOI commissioners is in Santiago de Chile. So I'm not going to the IAPP in Washington, D.C., but I am, in April, heading off to Chile, and I thought I'd better learn something about it. I thought I'd better also learn some Spanish in fairly short order, but that's going to be a bit of a challenge. I went to the gym the other day, and someone had left the machine, the running machine, on Spanish. I thought, this is good, you know, because I know start, and I know, you know, calories burned and kilometers and all that sort of stuff. Well, I'll do it in Spanish. I'll learn some Spanish. I found the whole thing so stressful. After about 2 minutes, I turned it off, pressed the Union Jack, and reset the whole thing in English. So I've got a lot of work to do on the Spanish before I go. What's the fourth one? Liverpool Playhouse. Well, you'll know the Information Commissioner is based up in the northwest. And I took the opportunity on Monday night of going through to the Liverpool Playhouse to see Educating Rita. It's on at the Playhouse till the 7th of March, and I just wanted to have the opportunity to see a Liverpool play with a Liverpool audience, and it was fantastic. I see it's coming to the Chichester Festival Theatre later in the year, but with Lenny Henry. Quite how a West Midlands actor is going to do that, I don't know, but I think it's all going to be restaged. That's fantastic. I'm very relieved to know that you had to ask which websites I visited, rather than that I was being tracked, which is a worrying trend these days. If you don't remember to switch off the location services if you don't need them. Just a word also about this venue. I've often passed it because you're very convenient for Euston Station. And I've never set foot inside it. I think it's a fantastic venue. How striking in the foyer to see the War Memorial with Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. Those of you who did all this stuff at O-level will remember that's the final line of the Wilfred Owen poem, Anthem for Doomed Youth. The old lie, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. So rather sobering to see that in this centenary period for the First War. The challenge which we all face in dealing with data protection and privacy was underlined for me the other day when my bus service that takes me from Altrincham to Wilmslow suddenly got modern, and the bus said, "Commute in comfort, free Wi-Fi." I thought, wow, that's fantastic. Let's look at the free Wi-Fi. Naturally, of course, I'm very cautious as the Information Commissioner about not just giving away all my innermost secrets without understanding what the deal is. So I got out the iPad and I looked at the the site and decided to check out what the proposal was. And of course, you have to say that you agree to the deal before you get access to the free Wi-Fi. So I looked at the terms of business and I clicked through, and it said, terms of business to be posted here when agreed. I thought, well, that's a good start. Let's have a look at the privacy policy. So I clicked through on the privacy policy, and it said data protection statement to be posted here when agreed. Well, I thought, give them time. Let's have a look at the disclaimer, because it's always nice to know what it is that you signed off. Yes, right enough. Disclaimer. Disclaimer to be posted here when agreed. And I thought, that's really interesting. I wonder how many other examples there are of free Wi-Fi when it's not entirely clear what the deal is. When I was passing through Belfast International Airport the other day, again, I thought I'd just check out the free Wi-Fi. That was even worse. I couldn't actually see the privacy policy before I'd clicked to agree that I liked it. So I didn't go there. I think there's a great piece of work to be done here by the ICO, though all the work will actually be done by others, just saying, crowdsourcing the research. Let's check out all these free Wi-Fi deals and find out exactly what is the proposition. Because my suspicion is that a lot of people pay lip service to data protection and privacy policies, assuming that we'll all say, yeah, tick, and off we go. And possibly there's either nothing there, or we won't like the deal when we look at it. So that's a piece of work for the ICO to kick off soon. I think this week we, and I mean you and me, the Direct Marketing Association, the ICO, and all those who've been engaged in the task force dealing with spam texts and nuisance phone calls, should really be celebrating, because at long last the government has agreed to put the order through Parliament to change the rules on the privacy and electronic communications regulations and get rid of this ridiculously high threshold around the imposition of civil monetary penalties, around the ICO having to prove substantial harm or substantial distress, which is very difficult, has been very difficult to do. But my persistent campaigning, led by the DMA, with the Information Commissioner joining in and then bringing in Ofcom, and with the gallant campaigning support of which the Consumers Association, we finally got the politicians to get on with it. And did you see the leading article, the third leader in the Daily Mail, the day after it was announced, saying, at last, the politicians are doing something that everybody wanted to see, a no-brainer. What's up next? GP appointments, wouldn't that be nice? This is something that was obvious, and it's fantastic that the campaigning, which I have to say was led by the DMA, has really come up with a very satisfactory result. And I want to give that as an example of the way in which the regulator, the ICO, needs to work together with other stakeholders to get things done. We don't pretend that we can do it on our own. We're consulting at the moment on our corporate plan. It closes today, by the way, if you want to comment on it. And the message is a clear course for changing times. And you're going to be hearing this morning about the upcoming changes to the European regulation. But there's so much change afoot. And the regulator has to accept that we don't know it all, we can't do it all, we have to work with partners. We work with partners with other self-regulatory bodies like the Direct Marketing Authority, with campaigning bodies like the DMA, trade bodies and so on. But we also see in the long term the importance of developing kite marks, if you like, our privacy seal program, so that we can work with those who want to get things right, who have an interest in getting things right. That really has to be the way ahead. In some ways, I'm talking to the wrong audience, because you wouldn't be here if you weren't part of the legit end of direct marketing. I've got to get the message through to the cowboys and the people who just don't know, don't care. Whereas if you're here, you're committed to the respectable end of the industry, and you understand about level playing field and codes and rules and so on. But we've got to get the message across to those people who don't get it and don't know. I think it's very important that we continue to work together closely. Occasionally we have interesting dialogues. I thought it was over the last year or so, and I wasn't here last year, my colleague David Smith did this gig, but I thought it was wonderful that we had the DMA guide to the ICO's guidance on direct marketing. Now, there's something wrong there when the DMA has to gloss the guidance which the regulator has provided for the industry. And we've had a similar interesting exchange over this splendid DMA code, which I commend to you. But we had quite an interesting discussion about the definition of unsolicited marketing communications, because we wanted it to be absolutely clear that only marketing that has been specifically requested can be regarded as solicited. And that's going to be even more important under the new regulation. And it's important that we get this sort of thing right, particularly important now that the stakes are getting even higher. The stakes are high because I know enough from my time in the advertising business that effective advertising depends on trust and confidence and high standards. But there's also this little matter of what happens when you get things willfully and spectacularly wrong. And you'll know that under the Privacy and Electronic Communications regulations, the regulator has the power to impose civil monetary penalties of up to £500,000. And under the regulation, the fining regime is eye-watering in headline terms. Some way to go in terms of how this is all sorted out. The problem that we had in 2012 with an outfit called Tetris was basically an industrial scale spamming operation designed to fish for contacts which could be sold on to others, highly profitable. And that breach of the Privacy and Electronic Communications regulations resulted in the Information Commissioner imposing a £300,000 fine. But as you will know, a year later, the first tier tribunal struck that down because we hadn't been able to establish substantial damage or substantial distress. Substantial nuisance, yes, but not that higher test. And we lost at the upper tribunal as well. And throughout that time, and it followed the Scottish Borders case, throughout that time, we've been saying to the government, you've got to change the rules to make this penalty stick, because you need to have that big stick in the cupboard, which everyone knows is there, that will be deployed for those who are simply having a laugh. Now we've got that change in place with effect from the 6th of April, thanks to the joint campaigning that we've done. There's a job of work to be done in pretty short order to revise the statutory guidance and to apply the new rules. But when I read in the Daily Mail, I liked the third leader, but I wasn't overjoyed by the headline on the front page, one complaint could see, one text could see the imposition of a £500,000 fine. It's not going to be that easy. It's not going to be that black and white. If you think about it, to make a serious penalty stick, it's got to be for an offence that's committed after the rules were changed. So after the 6th of April, it's that behaviour that we'll be monitoring, and it takes some time to build a case. So I hope we're not going to get a situation where a week later the Daily Mail is saying, hang on, where are they? And the politicians say, well, we did it, we sorted it, it's all the fault of the Information Commissioner. I want to know what's happened to the last 2 years. Stanley Baldwin used to talk in the 1930s about the years the locusts have eaten. We've been banging on about this for 2 years. I'd like to have used that 2 years to be in a position to start issuing those fines now, but it's going to take a little bit longer. So it's great to see the change. We're up for it. We're staffing up in our enforcement division to make sure this sticks. But it's not going to be instantaneous. Now let me move on and talk a bit about the European scene, which I know is the big theme today. After this, I'm going on to meet the new chair of the European Parliament's Libe Committee, a London MEP, Claude Moraes. We need to see how this is all going to develop and what's going to be the end game when we finally get to the trialogue between the Parliament, the Commission and the Council. But it's already clear from a run of judgments through the Court of Justice of the European Union that concerns about privacy are really impacting as a series of judgments on different cases come through the courts. And the consistent theme is the greater control for individuals over their personal information. And it's something we all need to be aware of. The Google so-called right to be forgotten emerges from a Court of Justice of the European Union case. We've got the Reines judgment on domestic CCTV. And we got the court's decision to strike down the original data retention directive. So quite apart from the regulation, you've got a series of judicial decisions that are really making a difference. And the theme all the time is control by citizens and consumers of their personal information. We need to listen to that, and responsible advertisers will take note. We also have great concern at the moment about national security following the terrible murder of Lee Rigby, the Charlie Hebdo incident, the Copenhagen incident. And the great paradox we face is the paradox of encryption. We've heard concern by some politicians that the industry trying to provide reassurance to consumers with greater levels of privacy protection is somehow getting in the way of the security services doing their job. We seem to be completely conflicted because at the one minute the politicians say the greatest threat to our economy and our way of life is cyber warfare, and we're all encouraged to encrypt like anything and keep our data secure. So it's cyber security one minute, the next minute it's state security, and by the way, companies who are providing encryption for their consumers are in some way acting unpatriotically. We live in very strange and conflicted times, and I hope very much that we can sort this all out. Now, so far as the emerging regulation is concerned, I would say to an audience like this, the message is don't panic, because the regulation is essentially the directive with added detail and with some current good practice recommendations being given statutory recognition. For example, privacy impact assessments, good practice. And to organizations concerned that they're going to have to construct a whole new compliance regime from scratch, I would say, if you are following good practice at the moment, you have not too much to worry about. It's going to be much clearer on what constitutes consent. And marketers would be well advised not to rely on implied consent, but be absolutely clear with your customers what it is you're proposing, and make sure that they've actually signed up. So my message would be, if you're doing it right now, and you're trying to do it right now, you've got not an awful lot to fear. I'm not saying there aren't details that need to be sorted out. I personally think that the various texts that are knocking around at the moment are rather too over-engineered and over-prescriptive in terms not just what companies and data controllers should do, but from my perspective of what data protection authorities can do. Because I think it's much better to have clear rules, clear guidance, and then the big stick in the cupboard to deal with those who won't play the game, rather than to tell the data protection authority that under this circumstance, this circumstance, that circumstance, that circumstance, and that circumstance, you shall impose a fine of up to so many euro and such a percentage of the global turnover. There must be discretion if principles of better regulation are to apply. So the battle really is to change the attitude of grudging compliance to one of active engagement. Someone put it to me yesterday, there is a basic cost of compliance, and say that's X. If you say X plus Y, Y representing what I call active engagement, you're actually justifying the expenditure which you've got to make anyway, the X, with something a little bit more than that, which is going to turn into engagement with customers and users. And it delivers something useful to the organization in terms of better marketing, rather than the minimalist, I'm doing this because I'm doing it and somebody told me I had to and I don't understand what it's all about and bloody hell, it's a cost and all that sort of stuff. Let's move away from that and realize that more active engagement and more active understanding builds up a relationship with customers, which is going to be so important going forward. Because in a few years' time, all these choices are going to be taken pretty much for granted. And the companies that are the first movers in the engagement game will be the brands that people trust and the brands that people want to deal with. Now, my organization, the ICO, is going to have to change pretty dramatically over the next few years. That's partly what our corporate plan is about, but we're also undergoing what the government calls a triennial review. So every 3 years, organizations like mine, in receipt of large sums of cash, either from you as data controllers with all your £35, or if you're really big, £500, and then the £3 million which I get in granting aid from the Ministry of Justice for the Freedom of Information work, we have not just to account for that year by year, but we have to examine ourselves and say, are we doing this in the best way? Is the Information Commissioner's Office doing things properly in the best way we could? And we're undergoing that process at the moment, and it's quite challenging. But what we know is, with the arrival of the regulation, whether it's in 2016 or 17 or possibly 18, who knows, the challenge to a data protection authority like mine is going to be significant, partly because of all those specific obligations in the regulation. We're going to have to learn to do things in a different way. And I see my role as Information Commissioner in the final, I was going to say 18 months, but it's only 16 months of my term, is to ready the organization for whatever change is required of it. Because our watchword has got to be being alert and aware and outward-looking and responsive to the needs of consumers and citizens and the needs of the business. We have to be very fleet of foot. And when I say that our plan is a clear course for changing times. That is what we aim to do. We want to continue working with the Direct Marketing Association and with the community. We're in the business of demystifying the rules and regs to make possible good things happening in the commercial world, in public services, and so on. I think my consistent message to this community is that the Information Commissioner is not just a traffic warden saying, no, you can't park here, you can't do that. We're in the enabling business. We're not in the denial business. To the extent that we are in the denial business, it's to stop the cowboys doing the stuff that gets in the way of the legitimate marketing activity that you people want to do. So we should be allies. We should work together. I hope we don't have to have many more examples of DMA guides to the ICO guidance, or we will have failed. Let's keep up the dialogue and make sure we're talking to each other in the interests of making clear to citizens and consumers what the deal is, what their rights are, and what services, whether commercial services or public services, we together can make available in a way that's safe and satisfactory, that makes the most of all the wonders of the internet and choice and all the other things that, if we do this properly, the citizen and the consumer gains. Thank you very much indeed for listening to me. Now, you get this annual opportunity to put the Commissioner on the spot. So if there are any particular points you want to raise with me before I go off and do my homework I see a hand at the back, and there's a microphone here. Perhaps you could just remind people who you are.
Christopher, thank you very much for your comments. I'm James Milligan from the DMA, and actually one of the people who authored the DMA guide to the ICO guidance. But I should just say that was a very good example of the dialogue that we had with your offices, because that guidance came out of a number of meetings and exchange of letters with your colleagues. My question is, you mentioned the issue of the paradox over national security. We mustn't forget that the European Data Protection Regulation was actually part of a package, and there was the criminal justice directive as well, which I know the sort of progress on that has actually been very slow. I was just wondering whether you've got any comments as to whether you think that the regulation will go through ahead of the directive, or will they move things through, or will they try and put the package back together again towards the end of the trilogue process?
Well, that's a question way above my pay grade. I might be able to answer it this afternoon when I've spoken to Claude Moraes, the chairman of Libe, because the chances are he may know. My impression is that events since the original Viviane Reding proposal, where we had a regulation and then a directive for the third pillar functions around police and justice, events have rather changed the debate. Because first of all, we had the Snowden revelations, which is where the whole encryption issue was highlighted, because the suggestion was that big internet companies were being invited to leave the back door open, and so that the security services would know what the vulnerabilities were. That's where I became particularly concerned, because the Information Commissioner's office was spending a lot of its time saying use strong passwords, only use encrypted devices, and so on. If that was all for the birds, that was deeply worrying. So that's a change. And then more recently, with terrorist incidents, you've seen great concern over passenger name records and whether that's within Europe or or travellers between Europe and America. And I think that there is a real concern among governments to try and get some answers to the security questions as well as the privacy questions. So quite how this is all going to be resolved, I don't know. I hope it's not going to delay the regulation, which is dealing with the business that you're in, because frankly that debate's been going on long enough. But it's interesting. If you compare the speech of the French Prime Minister at the Article 29 Paris European Forum on Surveillance in middle of December, with the speech he gave in the National Assembly following Charlie Hebdo, they're very different speeches. The December speech was very largely about privacy. Naturally, the National Assembly speech in January was very largely about security. So I think politicians are having their minds concentrated. I wish I knew what the answer was, but it's not clear. Anyone else? I'm going to get off very lightly this year. Yes, a question in the front.
Hi, Rosemary Smith from What For. Christopher, you spoke about the direct marketing guidance. Now, when it was issued in September 2013, there was some suggestion it was going to be revised after a year. So is there any indication that's going to happen?
Well, we'll certainly have to revise the guidance on PECA concerned with the new rules. I think there's been a bit of reluctance to rush into a revision of the guidance because we hoped that it was going to be clearer what the regulation was going to be. But as I was reading up for this, I did notice that we had committed to revise the guidance, and I thought, I don't think we have. So I'll certainly take that message back. Of course, as soon as the regulation is clear, there'll have to be a lot of guidance. But I do come back to the point I made in my address, that if you're following good practice now, you shouldn't be unduly concerned. There will be, as I say, details that we need to iron out in legislation and in the legislative process. There are a number of texts floating around. The Council of Ministers haven't quite worked out what they think yet, but the Commission knows what it thinks, and the Parliament knows what it thinks. And as soon as the Council gets its act together, then we can have the trialogue and we can iron out the difficulties. But I'm fairly clear that the principles that are set out in the directive remain relevant and remain good, and they're still there. The regulation is very largely about process. And if you are following good practice now, I don't think you're going to fall foul of the process obligations. But we shall see. But perhaps I should say, as soon as the music stops, we will issue revised guidance. Okay. I don't see a forest of hands here. Oh, I do. Yes.
Hi, Julia Porter from The Guardian. As a chair of the DMA, actually, rather than as a Guardian person, you said that you wanted to see yourself as an enabler rather than a traffic warden, which I welcome. I just wondered how you thought that might manifest itself.
Well, I think it's manifesting itself now, in the sense that the approach of the ICO is very much rooted in data protection. In better regulation principles. And it's quite an interesting contrast between the approach of some of my colleagues within the Article 29 Working Party and the way we do things. We prefer, and this isn't something I've invented, this was very much the Richard Thomas approach, which I've inherited, which is you concentrate on clarity, on guidance, on support. You have good information systems, good website, and so on. And then you concentrate your complaint handling function on identifying those data controllers who are clearly not getting it right. and you concentrate your good practice work in terms of good practice visits, voluntary audits, toolkits and so on in those areas. And you also focus your enforcement activity on those examples where people are just getting things wrong. By crowdsourcing, if you like, we were able, with PECA, we were able to identify the problem sites and the problem operators. That's what I want to do with free Wi-Fi, as I said. It's not about taking each complaint and following it through to the nth point in order to find some possibly technical breach of the rules and then throwing the kitchen sink at somebody who doesn't really know what they ought to be doing anyway. Our enforcement division, which is very impressively led by a retired Greater Manchester police detective, is doing great work in going after the bad boys. And that's how we identified the warehouse in Stockport and in the West Midlands, where banks of mobile phones with over-the-counter SIM cards were just firing off random number after random number. That's the sort of thing we ought to be concentrating on, rather than, as I say, the traffic warden approach. Now, sometimes the approach within the European family is a little bit different. And I get pitying looks from my colleagues in the Article 29 Working Party. Of course, you British are so pragmatic. Now, I think pragmatism is a badge of pride. I think pragmatism is almost an anagram of practicality. And I'm proud to pin my faith in a pragmatic approach. And I think that's what regulators should do. And I'm frankly not interested in a European regulation which is going to turn me into a traffic warden. If it is, this breach has taken place, you must fine up to X percent of turnover, so many euro. And I've said, you've got to give me the discretion to work out what the real harm was and to go and to concentrate my efforts in areas of the greatest harm. And one of the European officials I was dealing with said, "But Mr. Graham, we're not asking you to fine X percent. You just need to fine €1." And I said, "Paul, the effort I've got to put in, to fine €1, this is going to be, I've got to investigate, I've got to bring the case, there's going to be lawyers all over the place. This is just stupid. Let me reserve the big stick in the cupboard for the people who need a spanking. Otherwise, this is completely futile." The other thing, which I think I'm getting a bit more traction on within the Article 29 Working Party, is my question, where's the money going to come from? For these super data protection authorities are going to be going around fining everybody, and nobody can answer the question. And given the state of Europe, does anyone think that a top priority for public expenditure is funding a super data protection authority that's going to go around visiting every data protection brief and fining €1? It's not going to happen. So then we're going to have, if we're not careful, a wonderful piece of legislation which describes the perfect world where everything is pursued to the nth degree. But excuse me, it doesn't happen because the data protection authorities don't have the resources to do it. So I'm hoping that the trialogue is going to come up with something that's a bit more proportionate, with a good answer to who's going to pay for all this, and that we can, in the better regulation way of doing things, concentrate on those areas where there is the greatest harm. I'm confident we'll get there, but sometimes it takes a bit of plain speaking. I'm not one of these people who thinks that just because the European legislator passed a regulation, that that's job done. I think that's when the interesting work starts. There's a good principle of management: never confuse a memo with reality. And I would say never confuse a regulation with enforcement. Enforcement follows the regulation. If the regulation is over-ambitious and unrealistic, enforcement won't happen, and then you're in a worse position than you were to start with. End of rant. Right, just time for one more, if there is one more. And sorry, but I'm constantly looking into the middle distance, and I can't see what's laid before me.
Christopher, I'm really interested in your opinions on whose responsibility it is to help educate the end consumer, the person whose data we're all concerned about how their data can be best looked after. Is that a regulatory job? Is it a responsibility of organisations who are gathering the data? Is it a shared responsibility?
I think it's a shared responsibility, and it's a responsibility that I really want to share and work with the responsible players in the industry. We're developing our privacy seals framework at the moment. I think that's an opportunity for responsible marketers to help share the load. And I think it's in everyone's interest, and it's in the interest of marketers and advertisers to explain to consumers what the deal is. I think there's a lot of research around here. I was very impressed a couple of years ago with some research by Telefonica about how, if you're really upfront with consumers and explain what the deal is, what the offer is, consumers are prepared to share more with you because they understand the deal. Very often there's suspicion, there's a resentment and a resistance to giving away any information at all. Yesterday I went to the gym. I don't want you to think I'm obsessed with gyms, because I very rarely go, but this is a second story about a gym. I was staying for a couple of nights in a hotel not far away from here, which is next to one of those very useful Duncan Bannatyne gyms. And you can get a discounted voucher from the hotel to go for a morning swim. And I've done this countless times. And I turned up at the reception, handed over my voucher, and they produced 2 sides of A4 of information that I had to fill in. And I said, look, I've been coming here for years. You've got all this gubbins, all about what medication I'm on and blah, blah, blah. And they said, but that's not the important bit. Don't worry, they said, it's only for our marketing department. And I said, that's why I don't want to fill it in. So the guy said, okay, don't fill it in, but I'll be in terrible trouble with the marketing people. And you suddenly realise what the driver is. But I'm not going to go off the Bannatyne gym, don't worry. But I just think sometimes we can overdo the thirst for data, and sometimes less is more. And if you treat people as adults and treat people who by now have probably learned a bit more about the business you're in, then there's a partnership with consumers and brands. So I think the responsibility is partly mine, partly yours. And the deal is, I'm not going to be a traffic warden. I will try to be as useful as I can be in terms of explaining what the rules are, working in a cooperative way with responsible marketers and advertisers. And I think the penny's already dropped with the business, that having a more grown-up relationship with your customers and your potential customers is really the way to go. And I think together we can do great things. Okay, I think that's it. I wish you a very successful conference. Thank you very much for including me. When I come next year, it'll be positively my last appearance. But have a good day. Thank you.